Wind drifted low across open ground, pulling the last cold edge of winter through sagging fence posts on the old property. Gideon Frost, former Navy SEAL, worked without speaking, mending what the season had broken. He wasn't expecting company. His life ran on borders no one was invited past. Then, a pregnant woman appeared at the gate, clutching a battered suitcase with no place left to turn. She didn't plead. "I can work," she said, voice barely above the wind. "Just let me stay." Sometimes, the hardest act of bravery isn't making it through combat. It's unlocking a door you promised yourself would never open again. What started on that cold, damp afternoon was two shattered lives pulling each other back together. He nearly walked away from her. Something deep and unnamed wouldn't let him. If this story touches something in you, consider subscribing and walking this road with us. Now, let's begin. End of March, early evening. Snow had only just retreated from the fields around Flathead Valley, leaving the earth soft and unsteady. The air still carried winter's teeth. The farm sat exposed against flat, open country, wind sweeping across it unbroken, dragging the smell of wet soil and aging wood. Fence lines ran through the pasture in crooked, unfinished strokes. The barn stood silent, its doors hanging slightly off-true after months without attention. Gideon Frost didn't look up from his work. The hammer rose, fell, rose again, each blow precise, unhurried. He shifted his stance without excess movement. His gaze swept the perimeter every few seconds. Not intention, instinct. His hair had grown past any clean line. Stubble caught the fading light along his jaw. There was a sharpness living inside him that had nothing to do with farming, the kind of awareness that follows men home long after they've left the SEAL teams behind. Axel stood beside him, motionless and watchful. 7 years old, built like what he was, a trained K9, dense muscle wound tight beneath heavy fur, ears pitched forward, eyes never settling. Axel almost never barked. He didn't need to. Most people read the message before a sound was necessary. His presence alone drew a line few were willing to step across. The hammer froze mid-swing. Axel had locked. Not at a noise, at a disturbance. Something had broken the pattern of the place. Gideon traced the dog's sightline, his own body already coiling before conscious thought caught up. Someone stood at the far end of the dirt road, just outside the gate. A woman. She hadn't come closer, just waited there, as though calculating the distance between where she stood and where she desperately needed to be. Lyra Dane. She looked younger than the burden she was carrying. 29, though hard miles had aged her in ways that didn't show loudly. Dark hair, loosely gathered, with strands the wind had torn free. They clung damp against her temples. Dust lined the hem of her dress and traced the shape of her legs beneath it. The fabric pulled taut across a swollen belly that shifted faintly with each breath. One hand gripped a suitcase, leather worn soft, cracked at every corner. The other pressed against her stomach, fingers spread wide, holding steady what was inside her, holding steady herself. She moved forward, not rushing, not uncertain either. Axel's growl came from low in his chest, and he stepped half a pace ahead of Gideon. Every line of his body said the same thing. Unsure, alert, coiled. Gideon lifted his hand, slight and deliberate. Axel stopped. His eyes didn't. The gap between them narrowed enough for detail to resolve. Her shoes had been walked through at the soles. A thin film of red dust coated her calves. The way she redistributed her weight, small shifts, barely visible, constant, said everything words couldn't. She'd been on her feet for hours, maybe longer. Her eyes found Gideon's and held. "If you let me stay," she said, "I'll work on your farm." The voice came steady, level, carved more by exhaustion than fear. No quiver in it, no begging, just an offer laid between them like a physical thing. "I can cook, clean, help with whatever needs doing." Wind slipped through the gap between them, catching her hair, rattling the loose boards along the fence. Gideon didn't respond immediately. His eyes stayed fixed on her, but his mind had already traveled somewhere else, somewhere much older. A part of him recognized this moment instantly, the stillness right before a choice that can't be taken back. He'd lived through versions of it before, different terrain, different stakes, and beneath the recognition sat something else entirely, a hesitation that had nothing to do with threat. It rose from somewhere deep, not a fresh wound, but an old one, the kind that never fully closes, a shape of something that once held firm, then buckled. The feeling moved through him without needing language. Axel turned his head, brief, expectant, waiting on an order that didn't come. Gideon let out a slow breath. His eyes dropped, just a half second, and landed on the curve of her belly. A child. That shifted everything. He took a step forward, boots sinking into the wet ground. "I'd sooner eat what comes out of this dirt than anything sealed in tin," he said. Quiet. Almost offhand. "You know how to make something survive in soil like this?" Lyra gave a single nod. "Yes." Her gaze didn't waver. Gideon reached for the gate. The hinges caught, resisted, then surrendered with a long, dry groan that carried across the open air, louder than it should have been, like something forced back to life after being still too long. Axel stepped aside, just enough to let her pass. His body stayed angled toward her, alert. Lyra walked through. For one breath, all three of them stood inside the same space, close enough that distance couldn't shield anyone anymore. The wind died, and the farm, months of silence, months of solitary rhythm, shifted. New footsteps pressed into the earth. The front door shut behind Lyra with a flat, hollow thud. The house hadn't heard that sound in a while. Inside, the air hung motionless. Dust, old timber, something unfinished lingering beneath it all. A jacket draped half off a chair, one sleeve trailing the floor. Tools cluttered the kitchen table, alongside a chipped mug and a folded paper no one had bothered to move. In the corner, a box sat sealed. Forgotten or deliberately left alone. Dust lined the window ledge, catching the day's last glow. The place wasn't filthy. It just hadn't been properly inhabited. Lyra lowered her suitcase against the wall. Her eyes traveled slowly, surface to surface, detail to detail. She said nothing, asked nothing. She walked into the kitchen and reached for the mug first. Gideon stayed by the doorway, arms loose, watching without a word. Axel stood a few paces ahead of him, still turned slightly toward her, still deciding. Water hit the basin and filled the silence. Plates clinked. A drawer opened, then shut. Lyra worked through the space without rushing, moving around it rather than forcing it into order. By the time the sun slipped below the horizon, something had changed. Not repaired, just steadied. That night, She cooked. The supplies were thin: beef, a handful of potatoes, onions, garlic. But the smell that climbed from the stove moved fast, through the kitchen, down the hall, into the walls, as though the house had been waiting for it. Axel came in first. He sat near the stove, ears forward, tail resting light against the floor, watching. Not tense, not at ease either, somewhere between the two. Gideon leaned into the doorframe, arms folded, eyes tracking the small movements of her hands. The way she checked heat without glancing down. The way she navigated the kitchen like she'd memorized it already. Neither spoke. When it was done, she set the plates down. No ceremony. They sat across from each other at the same table. The silence remained, but its pressure had eased. Gideon ate more slowly than usual. Axel waited for a small piece, then took it gently, testing more than flavor. Lyra finished first. Her hand drifted to her belly now and then, unconscious, automatic. When she stood to clear the plates, Gideon spoke for the first time since they'd sat down. Lyra looked up. A single nod from him. He kept eating. It wasn't much, but something between them had shifted. Gideon woke before dawn the next morning, same as always. The sky still black, that particular stillness just before the first birds break it open. He stepped from his room, expecting the house to feel the way it always did at this hour. It didn't. A low light from the kitchen, something simmering, the quiet scrape of a spoon against ceramic. He paused in the hallway, then walked in. Coffee on the table, fresh. A plate of bread, still warm. Lyra stood at the stove with her back to the room, her movements deliberate, unhurried. Axel had already settled near the doorway, his eyes tracking her with something softer than yesterday's vigilance. Gideon rinsed his hands at the sink. Muscle memory, nothing more. When he turned around, the mug was set out and waiting. He sat, drank, said nothing, but he didn't get up to leave either. The shifts were subtle. Lyra didn't reorganize the house. She didn't ask permission or question where anything belonged. She moved within what already existed, adjusting only the smallest things. A towel folded rather than draped. A tool returned to the spot where a hand would reach for it next. A window cracked open, just enough for the air to remember how to circulate. Axel stayed closer to her now, not pressing against her, but no longer holding back. Some moments he sat nearby while she worked. Other times he padded ahead of her, clearing the room before she entered it. Gideon saw that too. He kept it to himself. That afternoon, finishing the last room at the far end of the hall, Lyra found the frame. It rested face down on a small table. She paused. Part of her considered leaving it exactly that way. Then she turned it over. A photograph. Gideon standing beside a woman, both of them dressed for a wedding. The woman leaned slightly into him, her smile wide and unprotected, the kind of smile that assumes tomorrow will come. Lyra studied it for a few seconds. Then she placed it back precisely as it had been. Wind gathered after the sun dropped. It swept low across the fields, leaning against the walls, threading through gaps in the old boards. Gideon sat on the porch with a mug, staring into the black. Lyra came out a few minutes later, pausing near the doorframe before settling at a short distance. She let a moment pass. Quote, 10, she said. But the woman in the picture... Gideon didn't respond right away. My wife, he said, his voice level, stripped clean. She lived here. Then she didn't. His gaze drifted toward the fence line. Left with someone else, real estate guy, college friend, the kind who always had the right words, always had the time. No bitterness in it, just a flat surface, smoothed by years of weather. Lyra listened without interrupting. After a while, Gideon turned his head slightly in her direction. "What about you?" She looked at her hands, fingers resting loosely together. "Why'd you leave?" Lyra drew a breath. Her eyes stayed down. "Sometimes you leave a place," she said, "just so you can begin again." The wind passed between them once more, gentler now. Neither spoke after that. They sat side by side, facing the same darkness, each carrying a different weight from it. The farm had started to shift in ways no one needed to name. Green shoots pressed through the soil behind the house. Small, but steady. Clothes hung in neat rows along the fence, swaying with the breeze instead of lying crumpled in some forgotten corner. The kitchen held warmth now, not just heat from the burner, but the warmth of something used regularly, quietly, with care. Axel had decided. He stayed near Lyra when she worked, by the doorway, beside the counter, watching without strain, not standing guard, just there. Gideon noticed all of it. He talked less, if such a thing were even measurable, but he stopped lingering outside as long. Some evenings he came in early, sat at the table for no particular reason, and listened to the low hum of the house settling around him. He hadn't planned any of it. It just arrived. The sound of an engine cut the quiet one afternoon. Gideon was out the door before it reached the gate. Axel moved ahead, body tight, gaze locked on the road. The car stopped. A beat of nothing. Then the door swung open. Maris Hales stepped out. Her steps came fast, uneven, like something had been building in her chest too long. By the time she reached the gate, her voice had already cracked. ____, quote, _18___. He didn't move. "I shouldn't have left. I thought I knew what I wanted. I didn't." She shook her head, fighting to hold herself together. "I still love you. I never stopped loving you. He's not who I thought he was. He's nothing. I made a terrible mistake." Gideon stood with his hands loose at his sides. His jaw tightened. Barely, but enough. The front door opened behind him. Lyra stepped onto the porch. Maris saw her. Everything froze. Her eyes traveled from Lyra to Gideon, then dropped and stayed low. "Who is she?" No one answered. Maris moved a step closer, her voice turning sharp. "Why is she in our house?" She exhaled sharp, half breath, half disbelief. "Don't tell me. That's yours? You moved on that quick?" Lyra answered before Gideon had the chance. "I'm just staying here," she said. "Helping out around the place, nothing more." Maris let out a laugh with no warmth in it. "Then go. This isn't your home. Never was." Lyra said nothing. She stood there one beat longer, then turned toward the house. The door shut behind her. From inside, the sounds of motion. Drawers opening, footsteps, the quiet scrape of a suitcase pulled across the floor. Gideon stepped forward. Maris grabbed his arm. "You're really letting her stay?" she said. "After everything." He freed his arm. "This isn't about her." "Then what is it about?" Gideon held her gaze, steady. "This place stopped being ours the day you walked out." Maris went still. He hadn't raised his voice. Didn't have to. "You don't know what these last 2 years looked like," he said. And you don't need to. The words carried no force. They didn't need any. They stayed where they landed. Maris opened her mouth, closed it. Whatever speech she'd driven here to deliver no longer held together. She stepped back, slow. The fight drained from her shoulders. For one moment, it looked like she might try again. She didn't. She turned, walked to the car, and pulled away without a glance in the mirror. By the time Gideon made it back to the yard, Lyra was already at the gate. The suitcase dragged behind her, catching on the rough ground. Axel stood in her path. He had the suitcase strapped between his teeth, holding it firm. Lyra looked down at him. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 33, underscore, underscore. He didn't release it. Gideon reached them a second later. Stay, he said. Lyra shook her head. I shouldn't. At least until the baby comes safe, he said. You've got somewhere to be out there? He looked toward the road. You don't. She gripped the handle tighter. I'll figure it out. Gideon paused, searched for the right words, gave up trying. I'm no good at asking people to stay, he said, but I don't want you out there alone right now. That was everything he had. Lyra looked at him, then down at Axel, the dog still holding the strap, patient, unmoving. Something shifted behind her eyes. Not much, but enough. A quiet breath left her. All right. Axel released the strap immediately. They walked back together, not side by side, not apart, just back into the house. Everything sat where it had been, but it felt different now. Lyra set the suitcase against the wall again. This time, she didn't unpack right away. Gideon lingered near the door another moment, then stepped outside without a word. Axel stayed in. He lay down between the two rooms, chin on his paws, watching both directions. The house settled into quiet again, but not the same quiet as before. Something lived in it now, something that hadn't been there earlier. Neither of them knew what to do with it yet. Time pressed forward, steady and unhurried, until the days began orbiting a single point, when the baby would arrive. The rhythm of the farm slowed on its own. No one decided it should. Mornings still opened with coffee. Evenings still ended with light stretching long across the fields. But the work changed. Less urgency, more attention to what was close. Gideon started on the room at the end of the hall. He made no announcement, just walked in one morning, cracked the window, and began. The glass had gone dull with time. He wiped it until it caught the sun again. The hinges protested when he tested them, so he swapped them out without hesitation. The bed frame needed reinforcing. He tightened every joint, checked it twice, then once more. Lyra noticed the change without asking about it. She passed the doorway a few times a day, slowing just enough to register what was new. The room transformed with each task he finished, not into something new, into something ready. He worked in pieces, never rushing, like he understood exactly what this room was becoming, even if he never said it aloud. The shed took longer. It hadn't been properly opened in some time. The door caught halfway before surrendering. Inside, everything rested where it had been left. Tools, old boards, a few shapes draped in cloth. Gideon moved through slowly, shifting things aside, clearing space. Then he found it. The cradle, pushed toward the back wall, half buried under a worn sheet. He pulled it free and stood still for a moment, one hand resting on the edge. He didn't move right away. The wood had kept its form, solid, deliberate craftsmanship, even where the lines wandered slightly. Built by hands that didn't do this daily. He wiped the dust clear with his open palm. Years since he'd last touched it. Back when it carried a different weight, back when plans still clung to it. He lifted the piece, brought it into daylight, set it down, and began. A rag, water, a screwdriver. Every corner wiped clean, every joint tested, each loose fastener drawn tight until the whole thing held again. No hesitation, no commentary. Just the quiet sound of something being mended. Lyra stood in the doorway, watching. She didn't cross the threshold, didn't say a word, but her face shifted, the way a person's does when they read a story without needing the first page. After a while, she turned and left him alone with it. The night it happened, the house had gone still. Wind had died. The fields lay flat and silent. Axel caught it first, one short, sharp bark, enough to split the quiet wide open. Gideon was already moving before the echo landed. He reached the hall just as Lyra's door swung inward. She gripped the frame for a beat, breathing hard but measured. "It's time." One nod. "All right. No panic." Nothing wasted. The truck turned over within minutes. Tires bit into the dirt road, kicking gravel behind them. Axel jumped into the bed without a signal, gaze locked forward. Nobody spoke the whole drive. The road unspooled ahead, empty at that hour. Sky still dark, just the faintest shift along the horizon. 4:15 a.m. Hospital light swallowed the darkness. Clean, bright, merciless. Gideon held back outside the room at first, one pace down the hall, then he stopped. Axel settled near the wall, ears up, waiting. Time bent in that place, minutes stretched. Every sound carried an edge. Then it came. A cry. Clear, strong. Everything else dropped away for a heartbeat. A nurse stepped through the door, voice even. "It's a boy." Gideon let out a breath slowly, as though he'd been carrying it far longer than he knew. Inside, Lyra held the child against her chest, bundled in white, still radiating warmth. He moved closer, slower this time. ___, quote _ 46 ___, the nurse asked. Lyra looked down at the baby, then across the room. Elias. The name filled the space like it had always been there. The days that followed had no clean rhythm. Sleep arrived in scraps. Hours blurred into each other. But the house itself shifted. Gideon adapted fast. Not flawlessly. He held the baby the way he held everything. Steady grip, small corrections, reading every tiny response. Axel kept post near the cradle most hours, never crowding it, just close enough to catch any movement, lifting his head each time the infant stirred. Lyra slept more. For the first time since her arrival, her rest ran deep. No jolting awake, no tightness across her shoulders when her eyes closed. The room at the end of the hall carried a different silence now. Not hollow, full. One evening, Gideon stood in the doorway, watching. Lyra sat beside the cradle, one hand resting light against its edge. Axel lay close by, eyes half shut but aware. Elias shifted, releasing a small sound. Both looked up at the same instant. Nothing rehearsed. It just happened. Gideon lingered another second, then stepped inside. No words. He reached down, straightened the blanket slightly, made sure it sat right. Lyra let him. Outside, the last light drained from the fields. Inside, the house held something new, something steady, something that required no explanation. The night it happened, the house had just settled into a fragile kind of stillness. Elias slept in short, ragged breaths. Lyra rested nearby, one hand always within reach of the cradle, even unconscious. Gideon sat in the chair beside the door, not reading, not occupied with anything particular, just present. Axel caught it first. A car engine, rough, decelerating too late before the gate. His head snapped up, ears pitched forward. A low rumble built behind his ribs. Gideon was already standing. Headlights slashed across the yard, too harsh, too reckless. The engine idled on. Then voices, loud, loose, carrying the sort of boldness that doesn't come from clear thinking. Lyra was awake now. She eased herself upright, one hand finding the cradle before she moved toward the doorway. Gideon stepped outside before anyone could reach the door. 3 men clustered near the gate. One drifted ahead of the others, working to hold his balance without letting it show. "Lyra," he called out. Took him long enough to track her down. She was leaving with him. That was the message. His voice slurred at the edges, alcohol pulling the words apart. Gideon said nothing. The man kept closing the distance. "You hear me? This ain't your place. You don't belong here." Lyra appeared in the doorway behind Gideon. "I'm not going," she said. No tremor, no hesitation. The man laughed, head shaking slow. "You don't get to decide that." One more step forward. That was all it took. Axel launched, fast, direct, jaws snapping shut, inches from the man's throat. The crack of teeth meeting air split the silence. Then he held, planted, immovable. The man turned to stone, couldn't move, couldn't breathe right. The 2 behind him were already stumbling backward. Gideon stepped forward, slow, measured. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 47, underscore, underscore. No raised voice, no threat in the tone, but every word carried weight that didn't need volume. The man swallowed hard, eyes locked on Axel. "You don't know what you're getting into," he managed. Gideon didn't answer. That silence said everything it needed to. A second passed. The man took 1 step back, then another. His companions were already halfway to the car. The engine turned over, louder this time. Gravel sprayed as they tore out. The yard went quiet. Axel held position until the last trace of sound faded into nothing. Then he returned to Gideon's side, calm, as though none of it had happened. Inside, Lyra hadn't moved. She stood in the same spot, still as the walls around her. Then something gave way. Not loud, not sudden. She lowered herself into the chair, pressing both hands over her face. The tears came soft, not from fear, from the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that leaves no room for anything else. Gideon waited a moment, then moved closer. He didn't reach for her, didn't try to fix it. He just stayed near enough. After a while, her hands came down, her breathing still ragged. "He won't stop," she said. Gideon shook his head once. "He will." She searched his face. "How do you know?" He held her gaze. "Because from now on, nobody touches you unless you say they can." The words hung between them, no hesitation, no hidden meaning. Lyra nodded, slow. For the first time since that car had rolled in, her shoulders finally dropped. The paperwork outlasted everything else. Weeks bled into months, calls, forms, waiting rooms. Lyra handled most of it on her own, quietly, without asking. Gideon drove her into town when she needed, sat outside offices while she went in. By early autumn, it was done. The court signed off. The past, at least on paper, was finished. Lyra didn't celebrate. She folded the document once and set it aside. Freedom didn't arrive as a moment. It arrived as space. Maris came back one final time. No sharp edges in her voice now, no argument coiled behind her words. She stood by the gate, something held between her hands. Gideon walked out to meet her. "I'm not here to stay," she said. He nodded. She extended a small bundle, a soft blanket, folded neatly. "For the baby." He took it. Neither spoke for a breath. Then she gave a short nod, turned, and walked away. Gideon stood there another moment, blanket still in his hands. "Thank you, Maris," he said, quiet enough that only the air heard it. Then he went inside. He set the blanket near the cradle. Maris left it. Lyra looked at him, then at the fabric. She tucked it around Elias, and a small smile settled into place. The wedding came together without much ceremony. Word traveled across Flathead Valley the way it always did. Those who once stood along the fence line, watching, whispering about the woman in his house, now walked through the gate with full hands. Those who'd kept their distance carried chairs, arranged tables, and stayed. Harold Boone showed up early, tools already out, repairing the gate he'd once said wouldn't survive another season. Etek Cole claimed the kitchen without a word. Ryland Voss built a canopy in the yard, steady, precise. Nobody mentioned what came before. Lyra stood beside Gideon when the time arrived. No long vows, no speeches, just a few words spoken clearly. Axel stayed close, a strip of cloth tied loose around his neck, still, watchful. When it was over, nobody hurried away. They stayed. Plates moved hand to hand. Voices settled into something easy, unhurried. Spring circled back. The ground softened. New growth pushed through the fields. Inside the house, things shifted again. One morning, Lyra stood in the doorway, holding something in her hands. Gideon looked up. She didn't say it right away. Then she did. "I'm pregnant." He went still for a second, then he stepped closer. "All right," he said. Just that. But the weight inside those two words had shifted. Later, when the baby arrived, a girl, Claire, Gideon stood alone in the yard as evening settled. Light pooled across the fields like something spilled and golden. There was a time he believed distance was protection, that locking people out meant holding things together. He saw it differently now. People leave. That truth doesn't soften with age. But sometimes one person stays, and that single act is enough to build on. Certain moments in a life don't announce themselves. No thunder, no burning sign. They arrive quietly. A stranger pausing at your gate, a hand that doesn't pull back, a door opening when it had every reason to stay shut. Some call that coincidence. Others reach for a different word. Maybe it's grace. Gideon had believed strength meant standing alone. But what broke through wasn't force. It was the willingness to let someone remain. And from that one choice, something invisible began its work. A fractured place grew soft. A defended heart remembered how to trust. A family formed in the space where silence had lived for years. If you're listening, Maybe there's a door in your own life that stayed closed too long. Maybe someone near you needs just a little room, a little tenderness. You don't have to do everything. Sometimes, not turning away is the whole thing. If this story settled somewhere inside you, pass it along to someone who might carry it too, or leave a quiet word below. I read them more often than you'd guess. And if you want to hear more stories like this one, stay a while.